Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Tonight, part 2 of the 700-part series of Ethics in the Modern World. And tonight I want to talk about, before we jump into specific topics or examples that we can work through, I thought it was important to stop and ponder what it means actually to think ethically. And as I mentioned before, we pretty much don't do this as a society. We certainly don't do it systematically. And so I thought it would be worthwhile to pause and to say, okay, let's just stop and say, what does it mean to think ethically? And first, what you need is you need to know what it is you're trying to achieve. What's the goal? What is your core value or values? And then you can decide, okay, how do you achieve that? These are sort of the core ethical questions. And I just wanted to go through a couple of examples from the world, because this is a wide variety of answers and a great diversity of outcomes. But if you look at just start classically with the Greeks, and of course they didn't agree on this, and you have someone like Aristotle, Nicomachean Ethics, very famous. And for most of the Greeks, the goal was to flourish, to live well, but by living well, they meant really to flourish. And Aristotle discusses a lot of different virtues or ethics that you need to flourish. What does one do to live well? What does one do to flourish? And amongst the important ones were courage, temperance, or moderation, if you wish. Also, you had this notion of being knowledgeable, to be wise, of course, to know how to apply such things. Self-mastery was a big one. Justice was a big one. Greatness of soul is one they talk about, which may be magnanimity. So if you think about these, these aren't right and wrong questions usually, and often they're quite personal. So while justice, which was a big category, was important to Aristotle in his Nicomachean Ethics, and that one has an external component, of course, but courage is always going to be within a setting, but what you're really worried about is how you relate to the events around you, and are you being encouraged within their context? It's not about doing the right or wrong thing, that the context is wrong or the context is right. It's like, so you have issues like justice, which are communal values, but you also have a lot of issues like courage or moderation, which are clearly much more heavily weighted towards personal values. Then you have greatness or spirit or magnanimity, which of course is a relationship, and this is usually a very personal relationship. Not necessarily you can be great towards your society, but a lot of this had to do with how you related to your friends or your family. And so these issues are, so again, as I mentioned before, sort of your relation your relation to yourself and your relation to those around you, but often with a big emphasis on yourself. For Plato, famously, the only virtue was wisdom. He said all other virtues don't exist without wisdom because you don't know what to do. And so wisdom is the greatest virtue, the key virtue, and the one that you want to pursue because, of course, and then this makes the philosopher the highest person, right? The greatest person in your society is the philosopher, because the philosopher is the one who has achieved wisdom. So then you should pursue wisdom, and then you measure your decisions on, is this likely to increase or create wisdom with me? Again, not is it wrong to do this thing or right to do this thing? Am I going to be judged? It's like, is this activity or this practice or are these people going to help me gain wisdom? If so, then that's, I guess, by definition, that's a good thing. And if not, well, you don't do it. But that's the kind of way you ask ethical questions. Both Plato and Aristotle were somewhat, not entirely, but somewhat at odds with their cultures, because the greater Greek culture was really built on competition and basically thriving through competition. This is why if you read the Iliad, so much of it is about, there's funeral games and everybody's competing with everybody. It really is this central core of thriving through honorable, important note, competition. And so there's a famous quote where they asked one aristocrat, what is the goal? What are you trying to achieve? And it was, I want to excel all men in all things. right? And so that, which is tricky, hard to pull off, but that sort of notion of this is a competition, we want to get out there and thrive and struggle and compete with each other, and that's how greatness is forged. And so this view of the world as a competition was more common. So they weren't opposed to wisdom. And in the Iliad, they talk about wise men and they honored them. But the competition is really the more generally acceptable and pursued goal, and associated that with honor or fame. We use the word fame now, but it was really more honorable mention. A lot of what we call fame today, they would consider to be infamy. You needed to be noted, but noted for something of greatness of, again, sort of a greatness of spirit in action. So what they called fame was heroic deeds done for noble purposes. You couldn't get famous in a good way for doing evil things. You might be known, but that is not at all what they were talking about. And so just within the Greek world, you have this quite diverse array of possible ethics to consider. By the way, you might want to write some of these down as I go along. So you can have you'll create a list, and then from that list, you can think about, which ones are, which of these ethics, which of these ideas or virtues are most significant to me in my life? What do I think I should be pursuing? So then you can look at something like Confucian ethics, and their goal there was to be the upright man, to be the scholarly gentleman, to be the noble human. And of course, unfortunately, this is almost all male focused. So, but you can expand that out today. We don't have to have those limitations. We can say to be the great noble human. And how do you be the great noble human? One is you want benevolence, right? To be benevolent and kind, and sort of human-heartedness is almost a translation for some of the Confucian ideas. You want to feel with and be kind towards those around you. And this is kind of a different sense than you get from the Greeks, by the way. The Greeks were very much more like, everybody fend for yourselves. That's all good. That's the best way to go. And then you had sort of righteousness, which was combined with the idea of justice again. So you have justice, that external idea. Proper rights was really big in the Confucian ethics. And this is the notion of publicly performing those obligations towards both your ancestors and your local rulers, and whatever the public performance of the correct rites created social harmony. And so this was a huge part of being the noble, upright person. Heavy emphasis on the scholar, noble wisdom, knowledge, wisdom end. So that was another integrity, hugely important. Fidelity, very important. And basically filial piety is what they call it. But what it meant was whatever role it was you were born into, if you're the second son or the third daughter, is to honor your parents and to adequately fulfill your role. This goes very much against the Greek ethos, because not that they weren't unkind or they said, be mean to your parents or whatever, but they really put a much greater emphasis on saying, these relations have to be negotiated, but you don't get a huge benefit from if your parents are crazy, you're stuck in these moral conflicts or ethical conflicts, but they recognize those problems, but they didn't really put this huge burden onto the notion of filial piety the way you get that in the Confucian ethics. And then if you go Taoist ethics, or I'm just sort of, some of the major systems of the world, again, they put they put a huge emphasis on the way, of course, and what this kind of means is hugely controversial, but it's virtuosity or excellence, right? So part of the way is being excellent in whatever it is you're doing. And so doing it well and doing it with a sort of again, nobility, maybe, again, we could use that word, but doing it with like the virtuous excellence. And we'll talk briefly about that again. And then you have Wu Wei, which is to do things. This is, related to the way, which is to Wu Wei, which we often effortlessness or without trying. And it's not that complex. I mean, it is a complex idea, but fundamentally what it means is doing things that come naturally to you so that you're not having to strain. And they thought that strain and keeping yourself lined up with nature was the key goal, that nature has a system in like a scientific sense, like gravity, right? Gravity holds you to the ground. So don't try to get off the ground, because then you're fighting gravity. Just be cool with being on the ground. And if you do things that are within your nature and in align with external nature, then they'll be easy. They'll be effortless. You don't have to try so much. That's how you know you're doing the right thing. And when you do the right thing, you do it really well, and you do the right thing in the right way, which is in conjunction with how you are, lined up with how the world really is, then everything is easy. And then you get this sort of virtuous excellence, this sort of just effortless capacity to do whatever it is you're trying to do. So and then you just don't do those other things because they're not very helpful. Also an emphasis, which is, it's hard to figure out exactly how to articulate this as an ethical virtue, but they thought you need to put a lot of emphasis is try and forget the names of things. And what they meant by this is try and see the world as it is, and that the way we name things and the categories we give them are not helpful. That's the problem with them. They tend to baffle and confuse us. And so part of wisdom is unlearning. And so a lot of the passages in all kinds of Taoist texts talk about, forgetting and not knowing. And then it's not an embracing of ignorance, quite the contrary. What it is, it's embracing, putting an emphasis on acquiring true knowledge. And true knowledge is not acquired through language, because the names of things often, or maybe even invariably, depending how you want to read them, mislead you. And so then the Taoist ethics is going to put a whole bunch of emphasis on, being in environments where you're not constantly inundated with language, reflecting on nature, being quiet, reflecting on yourself, letting go of all these societal categories and norms, because those are not nature. And so that's what throws us off. How do you get over that? You meditate inside, you meditate on nature outside, you let those words flow out of your mind. And so this huge emphasis on unlearning. It's interesting, there's almost an element of this. I mean, it's this bit of a stretch, but there is almost an element of this in Socrates, because what he's always doing is saying, oh, what do you mean by courage? Or what do you mean by bravery? What do you mean by wisdom? And people go, oh, well, I can tell you that. And then, of course, by the end of the dialogue there, the little Socratic play that's always works through, it turns out they have no idea what they're talking about. And so part of what Socrates is doing is attacking the names. And so when the Taoists talk about forgetting the names, getting the names, it's think the Socratic idea, right? Like, oh, you think you know, but you don't know. The difference is Socrates thought that you could figure this out, that with reflection and prayer and inspiration, you could actually acquire this real wisdom, and then something good happens. For the Taoists, like, no, language is never going to do that for you. You really do need to get that out of your head, that it's mostly just going to confuse you. It's going to give you false categories. So unlearning and forgetting a lot is part of Taoist wisdom, which is a great way to distinguish from knowledge. Like Confucian tradition really did emphasize a lot of knowledge, but for the Taoist tradition, they meant wisdom, and wisdom often meant not words, not text, not language. So it was kind of a clear distinction. And then finally, we can kind of leap over into Hinduism, which, I mean, the Mahabharata is such a, the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, the whole tradition is so rich and varied that what Hindu ethics are, this is a huge subject of debate. Often scholars have said there are no actual definitive ethics. It's too diverse. I think that's not quite true, but I can see where that comes from. But, you can look at a couple of key ideas there. One is Dharma, of course, which is this notion that you are in a cycle of action, and that this endlessness and participation in a big cyclical, revolving, feedback loop-filled world is very different from, most other traditions. This is within uniqueness and the power of it. So this is one. If you think of yourself as being part of sort of an endless cycle, this is really a different way of conceptualizing how and why you should act and under what conditions. Another part of this, which is really, if you pick a section like the Bhagavad Gita, quite famously from the Mahabharata, then you end up with a clear sense of like your Dharma is to fulfill your role. You don't choose your role, and different actions are correct depending on who you are. This almost, again, if you reflect something like the filial piety in the Confucian tradition, where what might be right for a mother is not going to be right for an oldest son, is not going to be right for a third son, is not going to be right for a second daughter, is not going to be right for an aunt, right? So what constitutes your role in the world and how you are a good person is very dependent on where you find yourself and what position you're in, and then fulfilling those obligations is essentially amounts to not all of, but a big part of virtue. And again, if you read the Bhagavad Gita, you get this whole thing about, self-sacrifice, that what you're doing is you're freeing yourself and liberating yourself through treating yourself as a sacrifice to fulfilling basically your role, your position, the medium that you find yourself in. So that's again a really different expression of understanding what you should do. And so when you read the Ramayana or you read the Mahabharata, which I strongly recommend, you see characters continually faced with these moral or ethical conundrums, like what should I do? I should do it. And, they make good and bad decisions that, they sort of meet or don't meet. And this is always the discussion of this is within Dharma. And often you get, the god of Dharma comes down famously and is reincarnated at one point because the god sort of forgot about how Dharma works. And so it needs to be reminded, and so on and so forth. And so there's lots of these actions and responses that are taking place and meditated on. And so you don't get so much answers, because this is the thing with ethical conundrums, is you often don't get clear answers. You just get ground on which to ponder, which is why I think we're not used to thinking ethically. So I'll just go backwards there. So then you have the idea of Dharma and, self-sacrificing to fill your role and position. You have the Taoist concepts of the way of aligning yourself with the way nature is to develop a sort of virtuous excellence. And then Wu Wei, that's, through effortlessness, through making yourself, being true to yourself and true to the natural world, which should line up because we're all part of the natural world. And then, something like wisdom is not in names, is not in learning of knowledge, it's in the forgetting of the names. Then you have Aristotle's, famous ideas of courage and temperance or moderation, seeking wisdom, and these sorts of concepts, all within the goal of flourishing. Whereas Plato is going to emphasize basically only wisdom, like the true path is only wisdom. Whereas something like the rest of the Greek world around them would have a much heavier emphasis on individual excellence achieved through competition. And that the life is a competition. You want to compete. This makes you flourish. This makes you well. And within that context, you're always searching for those sorts of ideas. So when you ask an ethical question, so if you write, maybe I'll put a list of those in the description underneath the video so you can reference that. But have those, maybe make a list of those so you can ponder that. So again, if you've ever been asked questions or you take a multiple choice test or something like that, see, it's hard to ask ethical questions because you really do have to ponder. And often it's like, famously there's there's an old man laying on a train track and a train is barreling towards him. And if you flip the switch on the train is going to hit something. But if you switch the switch, it'll switch tracks and you'll save everybody on the train, but it'll roll over this old man who's fallen asleep on the tracks. So do you do nothing and let all the people on the train be injured or die? Or do you interfere and flip the switch, in which case you've saved a bunch of people, but you've also killed one person? This is the classic kind of conundrum that you're getting. And I think this is really an disservice because it's a stupid question. It's a stupid question because we're almost never in a situation that requires us to do this. But we're often in a lot of other situations where we have actual, real, prominent problems that we have to solve on a daily basis, but we're almost never asked about those. I always find this curious that people love to ask, at least in philosophical circles, these really sort of abstruse, terrifying, usually it involves people dying. It never involves people getting a bunch of ice cream and enjoying themselves immensely. And then you ask yourself, well, really? Right? am I going to be flipping a switch on a train? I hope not. I hope I'm not in that situation. But I am going to be faced again with all kinds of other ethical questions. So I'm trying to think of one now that would be, sort of redolent of what we face all the time. But let's just take a simple one. Let's say your kids really like to sleep in the morning, but school starts early. So which is the better decision? To force your kids to get up early to go to school, even though they don't like it, it kind of makes them resent you. And it doesn't seem to be that healthy for them. And there's a lot of studies, of course, that suggest that, getting kids up at the crack of dawn to get ready for school is not that great for them. That they need their sleep, particularly as they get older, and that it would be better and healthier and they would learn better if school started later. So maybe you could just say, hey, tell the school they're not going to be in first period and I'm going to let them sleep in. Or you could say, no, they need to learn to go to school on time. That's an important lesson. Now that is an actual decision that most people face all the time. Our general way of responding to this as a society is to say, well, that's what the school says, so that's what we have to do. But we do this without much reflection. It's not like we go, oh, wait, I have a lot of choice here. We just go, well, that's what has to happen, so we'll do that. And so everybody's sort of miserable in this process. You're like, oh, I feel bad about making my kids go, but I don't want to fight the school, so I'll do this and that sort of thing. But if you actually stop and think about it ethically, then you have grounds. And you can either say, or you can say a whole range of things, but maybe you go, look, this is just silly. My kids need their sleep. They don't seem to be that healthy. I think they'd be a lot happier and better off if we just don't go so early. So I'm going to negotiate that somehow. Or go, they need to learn to get up early. I think it's an important lesson for them. And so this is not about the school making a decision. This is about me making a decision. And I think often we want to shift that decision, right? And go, oh, well, this is the schools, it's not me. And then this gives away a big part of, again, as I mentioned in the first lecture, your power, your authority, your sense of control. And so you hand that control over. But if we think about the list I just went through, you could go, oh, it seems pretty natural and normal for my kids to get up at 8. I don't know, pick a time. So if I'm going to go with Taoist, like, hey, this is their nature. This seems healthy. If I let them sleep until 8, they get up, they're happy, they're eager, they're ready to go. If I try to get them up at 6, it's just this brawl and everything is not working. On the other hand, of course, if they're staying up till 3 a.m. playing computer games so they can't get up, you go, oh, well, okay, I know why they can't get up, different problem, right? But if they're legitimately trying to get good sleep and all that, you go, whoa, if I value above all things living in conjunction with nature, then I'll probably say, hey, this is when they seem to be rising. This is when they're happy and healthy. Then that's the most important thing, and we'll figure out everything after that. Or it could be in the Confucian system. This is not even confusing in any way, right? You go, look, I said get up at this time. As children, your goal is to do that. And so we've just got to make sure they understand that system because that's the best system to operate in. And so my ethics are very clear here. It's not confusing. So in the Aristotelian system, you go, okay, where does moderation stand? How do I balance this so that we're not in extremes creating all kinds of trouble and tension? We want some sort of moderate path between any sort of significant trouble. And so again, what you're doing is you're taking the authority, you're taking the outside world and saying the outside world does not create the rules that I live by. I create the rules that I live by. Now I have to get those rules to interface with the outside world. That's part of what the rules are for and help you do, but still they are yours. You create them, you choose them, you put them into action. And it's really tricky, right? This is actually a difficult, tricky thing, particularly because, again, we almost never are asked to think about them this way. Again, if we put another, very common real world example, people, like we're in the midst of the great resignation and people, lots of people are quitting their jobs. Lots of people are also getting jobs. We had a huge hiring surge and we had a big quitting surge. What this tells me is a lot of people are going, I don't like the conditions I'm working under. And anecdotally and through some research online, and they're saying, oh, one is people want more pay, which is reasonable in a society that is denominated in dollars, to say, hey, if I can get more money from my work, why wouldn't I? And all of a sudden, I've noticed that all these fast food restaurants all over around well, there's not any really where I live. When I leave where I live, I see signs that say, oh, McDonald's is now hiring at $15 an hour to start, plus a free meal or something. I saw a sign. And I thought, well, that's interesting. Like a year and a half or 2 or 3 years ago, they were saying if we raise the minimum wage to $10, we're all going to go out of business, right? Like there's absolutely no way we can do business if we have to pay our employees $10 an hour. Well, it turns out when they can't get employees, all of a sudden it turns out to be totally possible, right, to pay them $15 an hour to start and offer them a free meal. Which, okay, great. Now, do people want to work for there? Maybe. But another thing that seems to be happening along with this is it's not just pay, it's a lot about work conditions. And what seems to have happened is during our sort of enforced period of reflection, as it were, people started going, or many people, a lot of, great resignation, so it must have been a fair number of people, started thinking, yeah, I don't like the way I was working. I don't like the way my job was structured, or I didn't like the people I was working with. Maybe I didn't like what I was doing. Some part of this I didn't like. And now that I'm going to get another job, I want something different. And what that difference is, of course, is going to be hugely variant. But notice that's the kind of question that people are asking. It's going not like, oh, I have to take whatever job is offered, or this is just the way work is structured. But they're saying, oh, maybe I'll only want to work 3 days a week. I don't want to go back in the office. I was just talking to somebody who said, yeah, we're going to be going back to the office, but everybody has decided it's only 2 days a week. But we're still arguing about that with the management, essentially. And it's like, oh, that's interesting. Like, but the way it was articulated to me is like, say, oh, we all, meaning like all of the employees, have already decided, yeah, we're only going back 2 days a week. And the management just, right, so they're basically negotiating this now, but it was clearly articulated like, yeah, this is what's going to happen. The management just hasn't caved in yet, which I thought was interesting. They just, maybe that'll change over time, but they were like, no, this is what we're doing. And they're going to crack. So, but what all those elements are, what this does though, is it shifts the power to you for how your life is structured. And when you begin to ask these questions, what you see is like, wow, we just don't ask these questions very often. And I gave the example in the last lecture of fusion power. And since I talked about fusion power, I went and did a bunch of article search real quick. I mean, I've been reading about it all the time. I'm interested in it as a topic, sort of a social experiment. And by the way, I should say, I'm totally in favor of like doing scientific research. It's just like the notion that this is going to lead to some sort of miracle revolution in power is totally absurd. But as far as I could tell, almost no one, I found one article that briefly mentioned this, is just the notion of, is this a good idea for society, right? Is it good to have centralized, super expensive power that will allow the current people who take, revenue from generating power to continue to take revenue from generating power? That was just never the question, right? This is just not a question that comes up, even though it's a very simple question. You don't need a lot of scientific background to answer that question. Basically, you don't need any. You can just go, how else could we do it? What are some other ways we could approach this? If I believe in going with nature, maybe I go, yeah, having a sun on the planet doesn't seem very natural. Let's not do that just because it seems to go against nature. If I'm going to emphasize something like, courage, and go, I don't think it's very relevant. That's not this maybe moderation. Maybe moderation would be one to think about from the Aristotelian and go, well, let's imagine that fusion power actually did work. And so it was totally free. And so we could generate an infinite amount of power for free, no cost, no environmental damage from generating it, nothing. If you're really interested in moderation, this is a bad idea and if you think about it for a little bit, you're like, oh yeah, this probably would be a bad idea, because what would we do if we could do that? I mean, could I heat my backyard to 75 degrees year round, so it's sort of a semi-tropical paradise here in the Pacific Northwest? Yes, I could, because I have infinite free power. Why wouldn't I? One, Aristotle would say this was very immoderate, right? This is not the path of moderation. That's the path of madness. The Taoists would point out, like, nah, that doesn't seem to really be keeping you in touch with nature. Quite the contrary, that seems to be putting you at war with nature. That is only going to create some kind of problem. We don't know what the problem is, but there's a lot of power and great expense is being used to damage nature. Probably better just to do nothing and just leave it alone. But imagine what we would do if all of us could use all of the power we wanted all of the time. I mean, heck, we could heat the Puget Sound. That would be cool. Why? I mean, our water's about 55 degrees. It would be awesome if it were about 75. It'd make swimming a lot more pleasant. And, we could have a tropical paradise. We could compete with those Pacific Islands to get all the tourists in the Pacific Islands. Hey, let's get some of them here. It'd be a great job. All right, we'll just what could possibly go wrong with that, right? And so once you start reflecting on any question from one of these core principles, then all of these elements tend to spring to mind that we almost, again, not never, but rarely or almost never ask ourselves. And so that's what thinking ethically really asks you to do. Abandon the yes-no question, abandon the universal solution, abandon universal truth. We don't care about universal truth. Well, maybe Plato does with wisdom, right? That's what he's really driving at. But besides Plato, most people don't. But if universal wisdom is your thing, then Plato's your guy. Go with that. So, so many different ways to think about these problems. But then when you really start asking them, wow, you get so much clarity. And what happens is you begin to feel the granular nature of the decisions that your society has already made. Just one more example here. The notion that people want to get around is a great idea. This makes perfect sense. We like to travel. We like to move around. Probably the private car is the dumbest way to do this, right? This is clearly like public transportation works really well if it's done well, of course. So private cars are wildly expensive, vastly inefficient, and destructive of quality of life and everything else. They're just crazy. It's a crazy idea. But it was adopted and promoted under an ethos of, it's not just your car, it's your freedom. And so this ethical notion of freedom got associated with it. What's happening now is increasing numbers of people aren't even getting driver's license. Increasing numbers of young people who could get driver's license. Something like 30% of people under 30 or 35 don't have driver's license because they're just in the United States. And they're going, if you look at the cost of insurance, you look at the cost of owning a car, needing to park the car. If you have environmental principles, you start thinking, and they're expensive, and so I don't really want to have to pay for them. And so I'm just making a quality of life decision that says, hey, this social norm is, for me, a bad idea. It does not help me thrive. And so I think I'm going to just not do that. I'm not going to get a driver's license. Therefore, I'm never going to buy a car. Therefore, I don't have this whole big bunch of worry loaded on me. And if I want to move someplace, it's just very easy because I don't have a big car or something to slow me down if I want to travel overseas or something. And so that's a very real expression. But if you look from the outside, like if you said, I really value the environment as being in line with nature, it makes no sense. I mean, it really makes no sense to have all these private cars in the world. And then again, if you apply this to something like, the electric car boom, on one hand, it's probably better to have electric cars. On the other hand, what would be really good is to have electric public transportation. Like replicating a better version of something that's really stupid is like better stupid. And then you're going to have all these questions about AI and all that we'll probably look at in the future. But like self-driving cars and such. So depending on how you look at it with your own ethics, make your own list, and then you can just hold all kinds of issues or problems or societal things up. And often you go, this just doesn't matter. Don't care about that. Doesn't fall with any of my ethics, so I can ignore it. Or you can go, this is clearly a problem. I'm like, this creates a tension between 2 or 3 of the things that I hold to be very core. So, what do I think about that? And so this is what reflecting and thinking ethically is about. One of the difficulties of it, of course, it's slow, usually pretty subtle and complicated, but I think infinitely fun to talk to your friends about if you have those sorts of friends, because there's just so many vexing and interesting questions that then reflect back on what you really believe. Final note, Nietzsche says this, not just Nietzsche, but many others, is one virtue, he says, is more than two, because if you have sort of an overarching virtue or ethic, it really helps clarify more than if you have a bunch. And what people like to do is tend to make a list of 9 or 10 things they really value, and then whatever the situation is, they just pick the one of those that allows them to do whatever they want, basically, which is maybe fine. But usually it's more clarifying if you can make a hierarchy or a list or something that says, really mostly I'm interested in this. And if I'm mostly interested in, say, health, then I can go down the list and say, well, this doesn't make health is not a problem. So maybe it interferes with wisdom, or maybe it interferes with beauty, right? Maybe beauty is really high on my list, and I go, oh, that might make me healthy, but it's kind of ugly. So this is the way I feel about gyms. I'm sure gyms help people make them healthy, but they just seem to be unbeautiful. The music tends to be bad. They're indoors. They're kind of noisy. I don't know. I'm not a gym person. Some people love gyms, by the way. They love gyms. I think half of the Socratic dialogues of Plato occur as on the way to the gym or coming back from the gym. Or I think Xenophon's, one of Xenophon's Socratic dialogues, I think actually occurs at the gymnasium, right? So, there's definitely a thing in the Greek world, but to me, it's just unbeautiful. And since I sort of want to, emphasize aesthetics and beauty, then you go, oh, well, I don't want to be in that environment. So maybe I'll be less healthy, but my environments will be more beautiful. Those sorts of creating hierarchies and having some really a core or a few core principles is helpful and more clarifying than if you have a huge long list that allows you to just kind of pick and choose whatever is convenient at the moment, because that's just a way of not thinking. So, part 2, introduction to thinking ethically, and then part 3 will actually start with our first issue, and we'll take just a lot of small issues and start pulling them apart, because as you start pulling them apart, all of a sudden it becomes, I think, very clear, like, ooh, here's what's going on. Here's the issues that underline this and how they influence our lives and how we respond to them and why we probably generally avoid thinking about these things. Thank you very much.